I'm Nancy Snow. I'm the director of the Institute for the Study of Human Flourishing here at OU and a professor of philosophy. Thank you for coming to today's event. We're grateful to our partner school, the Academy of Classical Christian Studies, for collaborating with us to make it possible. There's Father Nathan Carr. Thank you, big guy. Okay, our speaker today is Dr. James Smith. Dr. James K.A. Smith is professor of philosophy at Calvin College, where he holds the Gary and Henrietta Biker Chair in Applied Reformed Theology and Worldview. His popular writing has appeared in magazines such as Books and Culture and First Things, and periodicals such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and USA Today. He is also a senior fellow of Cardis and serves as editor of Comment magazine. The title of his presentation today is You Can't Always Get What You Want, Why Liberal Virtues Need Illiberal Communities. Please join me in welcoming Dr. James Smith.
Thanks so much. Thank you very much. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. Thanks to the Academy for making this happen, and also thanks to the Institute. I'm just really grateful to learn of the work that you're doing. I think it's quite singular, and I think it has a lot to say to a wider conversation. So happy to try to contribute to that today. Pluralism is both a feature and a bug of liberal democracies in late modernity. It's a feature insofar as the development of democratic and liberal societies are supposed to be societies with the mechanisms to recognize, honor, and let's say manage a diverse array of people and peoples with different ultimate conceptions of the good. So this is supposed to be one of the markers of liberal societies, an ability to recognize de facto what we might call worldview diversity of pluralist nations, what legal scholar John Inazu calls deep difference, and though also offering a prescription for living with that deep difference rather than quashing it or overcoming such difference. But I think we maybe all have a sense of how pluralism has also felt like a bit of a bug in the system, morphing into what seems like a virus, a veritable glitch in the matrix that seems to threaten the very project and experiment that we've undertaken. It's as if liberal democracy unleashed ways of being different that have spilled over the guardrails that we've erected, or have simply devoured those guardrails altogether. In other words, we're not managing pluralism, pluralism is managing us, and it looks like polarization. So polarization is kind of the cultural phenomenon that I want us to think through. And ironically, if polarization is some kind of pluralism run amok, it's precisely the Frankensteinish mutation of pluralism that opens the door to totalitarianisms and collectivisms that promise to quash polarizing difference by squelching difference altogether. So if we're primed to look for either a protectionist strongman or a nanny state, it's at least in part because some feature of liberalism has perhaps let us down. So this morning, I want to offer a diagnosis of the situation as a matter of liberalism's inability of late to foster the virtues necessary to stave off polarization. That's really my sort of core, is how did we get into this polarized mess that we're in? And I think a conversation about the virtues has something to say about that. In other words, there is a feature of liberalism that we've perhaps overlooked. In its ability to recognize, honor, and manage deep difference, liberalism offers, and of course needs, not just a set of laws and institutional correctives and guardrails, but it also needs specific virtues, both moral and intellectual, that have to characterize the citizens of such a society. Many of the features that we prize in a democratic republic, tolerance, patience, humility, public deliberation and debate, those depend not only on institutions and laws, they also depend on a citizenry that knows how to inhabit such a society. So, whence such citizens and whence such virtues? Where are they taught? Where are they caught? I want to explore the substantive conditions of virtue formation and consider why paradigmatically liberal institutions may be unable to inculcate such virtues, and why, ironically then, a liberal society depends upon institutions it might perceive as illiberal to actually be the incubators of the citizens it needs. Does that make sense as a hypothesis? Now, I want to be clear also this morning that I make absolutely zero claims to originality in what I'm laying out here. I want to use the occasion as a way to think out loud with you, see whether this is a helpful account of the mess that we're in, and whether this diagnosis might be the beginning of pointing a way out of it. So I'm most interested in getting to the Q&A where I hear how this lands and what I'm missing. So first, we have to recognize that a liberal society that is able to both honor and manage deep difference — I'm not thrilled with that word manage, but I hope you know what I mean about that. Work with it. A liberal society that is able to both honor and manage deep difference can't merely rely on systems, structures, laws, and constitutional guardrails. These are necessary, absolutely, of course. They are indeed the hallmark of constitutional democracy, and their emergence can only be heralded as one of the remarkable cultural developments of early modernity. But their necessity should not be confused with their sufficiency. I don't think one has to spend too much time watching cable news or, sadly, visiting university campuses to realize that these institutional guardrails are not themselves adequate protections against a fractious polarization that even at times looks like it's going to devour the very guardrails themselves. So instead, what I think we are beginning to appreciate is that even these systems and institutions need to be populated by citizens and actors who are characterized by dispositions that become the social glue of a liberal society, the grease that keeps the liberal democratic machine running smoothly. Or consider a different metaphor. I was thinking, I'm in football, I'm in Oklahoma, I should try a football metaphor, okay? So this is the best. You can't put in place a West Coast offense with couch potatoes from Saskatchewan. What I mean is, the offensive system needs to be populated by players with the requisite strengths and talents. So similarly, the good gifts of constitutional democracy presume that they will be inhabited by the kinds of citizens and agents with the requisite strength and dispositions that make the system work. And of course, we call those dispositions virtues. John Inazu, teaches at WashU in St. Louis in constitutional law, has pointed this out in, I think, an important book called Confident Pluralism. While Inazu attends to the important systemic concerns about constitutional law and precedent — that's the first half of the book — he also rightly recognizes that forging a common life in the midst of deep difference requires specific dispositions, as he calls them, of tolerance, humility, and patience. Such dispositions, such character traits, of course, are virtues. Which leads us back to the question, whence virtue? What are the conditions for the formation of virtue? And that's what I would like to turn to briefly. Here, I want to recall the important work of Alistair MacIntyre as just one way to frame this analysis and conversation, which I can only rehearse schematically here. As MacIntyre lays it out, the inculcation of virtue is the effect of a complex social system that is characteristic of certain kinds of communities. In particular, virtues are inscribed by our immersion in practices that are, in a sense, the enacted repertoire of rhythms and routines of a tradition that is animated and oriented by a narrative or a story that specifies the good of human flourishing. Okay, so you've got practices, rhythms, and routines of a community that in a way are the repertoire of a tradition, and the tradition carries a narrative, a story about what the good life is. It specifies the good of human flourishing. It is some narrative, some almost capital S story, one might even say some myth, that articulates the telos of human flourishing. I mean, here I am telling you guys this. You know all this. Insofar as virtues are virtues, precisely because they are excellences, of course, they are always telos relative. So you'll notice that this means virtue is only caught in the practices of communities that actually specify the good. Right? You have to specify the telos to even know what would count as a virtue. In other words, virtue is only caught in communities of practice that submit themselves to a tradition and identify a narrative as governing their conception of the good, the telos. As MacIntyre summarizes it, quote, "It is always within some particular community, with its own specific institutional forms, that we learn or fail to learn the exercise of the virtues." Or, as James Davison Hunter has succinctly put it in a book on education, actually, The Death of Character, there have never been generic values. There are not generic values. What makes communities formative is precisely that they are the heirs of a tradition to which they submit, and that tradition carries a narrative that specifies the good, the telos, in some substantive ways. It's that substantial specification of a telos that specifies now what counts as a virtue. Okay, so, as MacIntyre famously puts it, I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I am able to first answer the prior question of what story or stories am I a part. Some specific story carried in the practices of a tradition that animate a particular community provides the frame and context for a life well lived. All of these features, okay, the specification of a telos, a narrative frame, the practices of a tradition, are the formal conditions for the acquisition of those dispositions that we call virtues. MacIntyre gives a specific example that I think is actually a little bit suggestive given the question on the table today. One example is patience, okay, patience. To treat patience as a virtue, he points out, presupposes some adequate answer to the question, waiting for what? Waiting for what? So the point is that without my immersion in and submission to a tradition, a story that makes sense of waiting in some way, there will be circumstances in which the recalcitrance of things or people or evil look like reason enough to either give up or force the issue and become impatient in a way that makes me abandon restraint, right? So there are many bad ways to be impatient. So in contrast, MacIntyre remarks, well, here's his example, quote, "Medieval exponents of the virtue of patience claim that there are certain types of situation in which the virtue of patience requires that I do not ever give up on some person or task. Situations in which, as they would have put it, I am required to embody in my attitude to that person or to that task something of the patient attitude of God towards creation. But this could only be so if patience served some overriding good, some telos, which warranted putting other goods in a subordinate place." Does that make sense? Does that picture? Now that would just be one story. That is an example that would make sense of why I should wait. So why wait is a question that needs an answer from a tradition that transcends the tyranny of the present. The answer to such a question needs to come from elsewhere. And only if I'm located in some story that makes sense of waiting will we be able to sustain the practices that inculcate the virtue of patience. And I think one could worry that this is, in fact, one of the most jarring and disconcerting losses in our current cultural moment. That in some ways, I wonder if there's a way to make sense of polarization, exactly in this term, right? That polarization is not just an intellectual hubris that imagines our enclave and our enclave alone is right. That's contra humility, of course. It also demands that everyone agree with us now, right? So there's an impatience about it. And it's more and more willing to run roughshod over anyone who doesn't agree, and therefore is contra-tolerance, right? So you can make sense of polarization as the feature of a vicious society. It always sounds mean when you say vicious. I mean vicious in the technical sense, right? It's not a compliment, but so in sum, so far, I've suggested that a liberal society needs both institutions and citizens characterized by specific virtues that are conducive to living with deep difference. And I think it's a particular catalog of virtues that make that possible. And the inculcation of such virtues requires thick communities governed by narratives that specify the good. So now we arrive at the nub of our question. If liberal societies require citizens with such virtues, can prototypically liberal institutions form such virtues in citizens? Or is polarization a kind of manifestation of a certain pluralism run amok? Is polarization a sign that liberalism can't have what it wants, or at least can't generate what it needs? And that's closer to where I'm going to land, I think. Now, before continuing the analysis, let me tentatively suggest a distinction that is both conceptual and historical. And this is totally, I'm floating this, and I'm waiting for somebody to quash it immediately in the Q&A, because I'm not sure how sustainable it is. But I want to try out a distinction. On the one hand, it's a conceptual distinction. On the other hand, it's a historical distinction. Historically, I would like to suggest that there is a distinction between something like early modern liberalism as a vision and an experiment, and late modern liberalism as its own worldview or social imaginary. Or conceptually, to put it conceptually, this might map onto a distinction between what we might call, I'm going to call liberalism as social architecture, liberalism as a social architecture, versus late modern liberalism as its own ethos, as its own mythology about autonomy. It is the latter, liberalism as ethos, liberalism, that Alistair MacIntyre always decries as liberal individualism, right? So a lot of MacIntyre's critique in After Virtue is a critique of liberal individualism. I want to say that liberal individualism is synonymous with liberalism as ethos, liberalism as myth. While this is without question a dominant expression of what liberalism has come to mean, I want to signal that I don't think liberalism per se is synonymous with liberal individualism. So one could be very critical of the inadequacies and distortions of a liberal individualism and not necessarily be critical of liberalism per se. Indeed, one might be very critical of liberal individualism for the sake of liberalism per se. We'll see if this works, okay? So, how might this distinction help us analyze our present situation of polarization and answer the question I'm posing? Well, one could then suggest that the reason late modern liberal societies seem to lack the virtues necessary to manage pluralism and difference is not because they are liberal, but because their liberal social architecture is now inhabited by citizens who are no longer shaped by thick formative communities that inculcate the requisite virtues needed to inhabit that kind of social architecture. Or one could float a historical thesis that the genius and gift of liberalism as a social architecture were always dependent upon communities of practice that shaped the sorts of virtuous citizens that populated those kinds of liberal societies. And those communities of practice we might have actually sometimes described as illiberal. I'll come back to that. But now, if you're telling this as a historical story, once liberalism as ethos, MacIntyre's liberal individualism, became the dominant social imaginary of people in late modern societies, and as they were more and more unhooked and disembedded from thick formative communities, they no longer inculcated the virtues that liberal society has always depended on. So the result are the vices of tribalism we grapple with today that now sometimes threaten the very viability of the liberal social architecture. If, this is a big if something like this were true, it would explain why liberalism as ethos, which regards thick, formative communities as illiberal because they impinge on the preferences of the autonomous individual, it would explain why liberalism as ethos ends up dismantling the scaffolding that liberal social architecture actually requires. Liberal individualism is like an ungrateful trust fund heir who keeps spending down the endowment that made his life possible. Again, my suggestion here is not original. In fact, I think Yuval Levin, in his very important book, The Fractured Republic, has made the same point with a Tocquevillian. You can totally run a Tocquevillian analysis of this same point, that in many ways, the ideal of a pluralistic liberal society lived off the borrowed formative capital of illiberal communities, including families and religious communities, as incubators for the dispositions of good citizenship. But insofar, and this is Levin's point, insofar as both liberalism as ethos and, he points out, capitalism tend to devour and erode just those sorts of institutions and communities, they end up being a parasite that consumes the host and thus engender their own demise. They're sort of starved by their own hunger in that respect. And insofar as liberalism as ethos is really allergic to specifying the good, it can't simply come up with its own replacement incubators of virtue. Liberal institutions that are governed by this mythology of liberal individualism will not have the specificity or thickness to instill virtue. Now, just before anybody immediately concludes that this is some sort of, don't immediately conclude that my critique is coming from the right. Okay? Because there's equally a critique of what passes for conservatism today, which is really just libertarianism that has all the same corrosive effects on these institutions. So I think I'm an equal opportunity offender in this. Consider an interesting example I recently considered when looking at the history of civics education in Canada. I'm Canadian, so not all of us are spending our weekends doing this, but I was... it's become an interesting conversation in Canada in public schools about the possibility of civics education. And in the opening paragraph of a 1994 government study, a report called Citizenship Education in Canada, the report seems to concede the point I'm making here. And I cite this just as a small example. Here's what the report says. First paragraph. Education for good citizenship is important, not only for its effects on politics and government, but also in relation to community and voluntary activities and social and international harmony. While always a general goal of educators in Canada, this aspect of education did not receive a great deal of formal attention in the past. Reliance was placed on the home and church, as well as the school, to instill in young people the principles of loyalty and adherence to duty that were considered the main component of good citizenship. In today's rapidly changing world, however, the adequacy of this traditional approach to citizenship preparation is being questioned, and there is evidence of renewed interest in the topic both in Canada and abroad. Do you notice here there's a bit of a historical thesis that's going on there as well? What the report fails to do, however, is diagnose just what changed so rapidly and whether state schools are adequate substitutes for these prior incubators of civic virtue. And I do think that that's an honest question that we have to face, okay? Now, it seems to me that there could be a couple of criticisms of the ethos of late liberalism on this score. And these two criticisms might not be mutually exclusive, so these could be a package deal. First, one could point out that late modern liberalism effectively forfeits any ability to be able to inculcate the virtues needed for a liberal society precisely because it is officially agnostic about naming or identifying a substantive good for human flourishing. That is, insofar as late modern liberalism pretends to a neutrality about ultimate goods, it must be agnostic about the good. And insofar as it is agnostic about normative conceptions of the good, it must also be agnostic about the dispositions that would actually count as virtues. While the social architecture of liberalism, of course, leaves room for the pursuit of the virtues and for what we might call sub-societal or civil society communities to specify the good and hence virtue, inculcate virtue, liberal society and its institutions would be unable to do so. Furthermore, and perhaps more radically, insofar as late modern liberalism only conceives of freedom as autonomy, yielding an atomistic conception of the self, and hence society is basically this bucket of social atoms, this very conception of freedom would seem to preclude any naming or identifying of a good beyond my own preference and choosing. As McIntyre observes, for liberal individualism, a community is simply an arena in which individuals each pursue their own self-chosen conception of the good life. And if that's the arena, then you have effectively already forfeited the possibility of there being such a thing as virtue. If there's no normative good beyond my preference, there's no longer virtue. Or, at least, the only remaining virtue is something like resoluteness. Do you like choosing? The resoluteness is the Heideggerian version of the, not that you talk a lot of Heidegger here, but the result then is a social atomism that veritably precludes virtue because it precludes an imposition of a normative good on the autonomous self. So that could be one way to name what the challenge or problem is here. Or second, one could argue that late modern liberalism is actually kind of inauthentic in this regard. It's characterized by a certain bad faith. While it pretends to be officially agnostic about the good and pretends to neutrality about a substantive telos for human flourishing, in fact, under the guise of its neutrality, it now covertly advances a particular substantive vision of the good. And in this respect, one might suggest that our liberal democracies, which were really experiments hatched to honor and manage deep difference, have taken a side amidst those differences. They are deciding in favor of a particular triumphant, ascendant conception of the good that is shared. And now there can be both, for lack of a better term, left and right versions of that, right? So either we've decided to privilege the libertarian story of the market's goods and gifts to us, and then we're going to enshrine that story. Or the other side would be something like a conception of the good that's parroted by cosmopolitan elites and safeguarded by universities and rehearsed at the Academy Awards acceptance speeches. There's ways. This is the way polarization works: is you can both tell stories about the other side like that. In that case, the problem isn't neutrality and agnosticism, but actually the specific narrative and conception of the good that animates liberalism as an ethos. And whether the real question now is it governed by a story that can narrate why we ought to value patience, tolerance, and humility as virtues? In that case, the critic would not simply be criticizing a feigned neutrality, but rather the inability of the substantive story of late modern liberalism to sustain the kind of society it used to celebrate, one characterized by tolerance, patience, and the forging of a commonweal despite deep difference. Then the problem isn't just that liberalism can't have what it wants, then the problem would be what it wants, which has become something else. But, and I'll close with this, if liberalism still prizes the features of liberal social architecture that make for healthy pluralist societies, it's going to have to grapple with the question of where the citizens for such a society are formed. Is our polarization, our fragmentation, the resulting stagnation enough to get us to reconsider our dismissal of so-called illiberal communities? We might be in a place where late modern liberalism needs to consider an uncomfortable truth that the sorts of citizens who well animate a liberal society cannot be produced by liberal institutions. And we might all be in a place where we need to consider a better story about who we are and what we're for and how we might live together. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I think we have some time for questions. So this gentleman has certainly gotten his oar in the water right away. I'll just point them out to you.
Okay.
If that's okay.
Great.
Yeah.
That sounds great.
Thank you very much. I guess I want to buy into the historical framework you suggested rather than quash it. I think you described it as a transition from liberalism as a social architecture to liberalism as an ethos, a kind of overarching social imaginary.
And I do so very tentatively, so I'm happy to learn how to make that more
in that
careful.
case, I'll try to be tentative too. But you mentioned Yuval Levine and Tocqueville, and I wonder if it's worthwhile going back even further and talking about Edmund Burke as the figure who maybe is most, the original figure who is trying to articulate and indeed defend liberal goods within 18th century society, recognizing that the thing that threatens those goods is the erosion of what you're calling sort of illiberal
Little
traditions
platoons,
and
right?
ideas. Well, sure, yeah, sure, the little platoons. Burke spends his career defending the freedoms of the Indians and the Irish and the American colonists against authoritarianism, and then in 1789, he decides that the French Revolution is endangering those very freedoms because it's not because it's trying to erase the past and start again. And so, for Burke, fundamentally, the conditions whereby we are free and can flourish depend upon kind of prior instantiations, prior local cultural instantiations of overarching things like freedom and dignity, that sort of thing. So I'm wondering if Burke has any place.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I mean, and he's looming huge behind Levine's argument too, right? There's partly this is a almost a rhetorical strategy, which is if you are trying to win friends and have influence with your liberal interlocutors, citing Burke out of the gate is not usually the way to do. So I agree, and I think for the most part, I think people have a caricatured conception of what they think they're buying into if they were to go back to Burke. So I totally agree. I think that the Tocqueville piece makes it sort of indigenous to the American experiment. And so, well, except he's a French observer, but there's at least, it's sort of like, it feels like an account of our story. That's odd that I just said that, but yeah. My citizenship application is in process, so I'm trying to say as many positive things. The word is the Immigration and Naturalization Service now reads Twitter feeds, so given everything I've said about Donald Trump, I'm trying to like up my pro quotient here. Yeah, so I totally agree. And there's probably, I think there are many resources for thinking about that. What I'm looking for is ones that feel a little easier for people to take off to the shelf who might have reservations or suspicions in that. If that's, and that's not to be cynical. It's that I want. Part of it is trying to overcome the caricatures we have of one another and about those things. Absolutely, though. Yeah, it's great.
Anyone else?
Well,
Other than John Mark. He was formerly a dissertation fellow at the Institute, so
Great.
We have a long history and tradition of giving him a hard time.
Yeah.
Virtue.
Great.
well, given your desire to find figures that are palatable, in particular within an American tradition, I think of people like William Pitt and Roger Williams, who are great advocates of tolerance in general and religious tolerance in particular, that this is rooted in a particular religious, spiritual narrative, which is, I think it was Robert Wilkin recently argued, that is explicitly rooted in ante-Nicene church fathers like Tertullian that are coining terms like religious liberty, but not in defense of a conception of freedom as radical autonomy, but in a conception of positive liberty, but there are certain goods that can only be given in a non-coerced way. They can only be given if they're cultivated within a community of love. And so we have these American figures who are kind of champions of tolerance, but this version of tolerance is being rooted in a particular spiritual tradition. That's actually a pre-Christendom.
So which would counter a certain narrative which imagines that tolerance was sort of the unique fruit of Enlightenment rationality rather than actually. Yeah, in fact, Timothy Shaw at Georgetown and a co-author have just published this 2-volume history of religious freedom in which they actually go back and say Tertullian is the first person to really articulate a principle of religious freedom. So it was, the roots of a religious freedom doctrine are themselves religious, which is, I think, intriguing. Yeah. For example, if you're thinking of to use Dr. Zagzebski's language, in some ways, I also think the civil rights movement is an incredible exemplar of what we're talking about here in this sense. The capacity for those witnesses and martyrs, almost one might say, of the civil rights movement, to be able to bear witness and call the nation to a good was very clearly an effect of their having been formed in particular communities of practice that enabled them to do that in ways that were nonviolent. So this is Charles Marsh's book, The Beloved Community, which is sort of a history of the civil rights movement, in which he shows how much it was living off of the capital of ecclesial practices in the black church that made it possible for people to have the virtues, I would say, to do that. And so I do think this raises interesting questions about the extent to which, or the ways in which, religious communities actually have something to contribute to the liberal project. Do you know what I mean? Like, Levine does this too. He thinks Judaism actually makes good liberal citizens. He loves Moses Mendelssohn, things like that. The only challenge is, so I think there's an important argument to be made there. It's just that I don't think today anyone would be empirically very quickly inclined to assume that religious congregations are generating more tolerant, patient. Do you know what I mean? Like, so then what you need is an account of the way in which, so to say that you actually need, quote unquote, this is not my term. I would not use the word illiberal if it was up to me. I'm sort of taking a term off the shelf. But to make the case that you actually, the kinds of communities that form virtue will have some of the characteristics that from liberalism look illiberal, is not the same thing as saying that all illiberal communities form the requisite virtues, right? Those are not interchangeable claims. And I think actually what you would need is an account of all the ways in which it seems like so many, for example, religious communities in our contemporary context have only fomented the polarization and not countered it. And so then you need some account of why their deformation happened or something like that. Maybe, or the extent to which we've all kind of drunk the Kool-Aid of autonomism, and it's been an overwhelming sort of deformation. Yeah.
I'm going to take advantage of this lull in the action to abuse my role
Great.
as moderator and ask a question. So I wonder, as you were giving your talk, I thought back to my days as a graduate student back in the Pleistocene era. And, I did my dissertation on John Rawls.
Sure.
And, And a paper came out entitled Justice's Fairness, Political, Not Metaphysical. And you probably know where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
But there are thick conceptions of the good and there are thin conceptions of the good.
Yes.
And what Rawls advocated in that paper was basically that liberalism, liberal democracy, should endorse a thin conception of the good as a kernel of an overlapping consensus.
Yes.
And so those virtues would be something like patience, tolerance, the ones that you've mentioned. They would not be thinly instantiated in persons, but they would be part of an overall culture, a liberal culture,
Yep.
in which groups that are deeply committed to different substantive conceptions of the good can in fact get along.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering what your
Yeah,
take would
yeah.
be on that possibility.
So it's jarring to me the extent to which I have had positive thoughts in my head about John Rawls over the last 2 years, because I come from a tradition of, I'm more in the sort of Macintyrian school, which has tended to be skeptical of that. And of course, Rawls qualified that in really interesting ways in political liberalism. I think the piece that I still want to push back on what could be a simplistic inheritance of Rawls is that I still look at that as mostly a social architecture kind of account. And then what I'm saying is I think it has been inadequately attuned to the dynamics of the formation of the sorts of people who can move about in that architecture well. So I guess maybe I'm coming to a place where I kind of want to imagine that MacIntyre and Rawls aren't as antithetical as we might have suggested, though I don't want to make that sound too rosy and kumbaya. But there's a way in which, so Jeff Stout's critique of Rawls, I think on this is right, that what was wrong with Rawls was the suggestion of a certain kind of neutrality about that picture, whereas instead what we should, and I think in political liberalism he comes close to something like this, in a way, a good liberal social architecture is going to actually leave room for and maybe even encourage these thicker substantive communities to do that formative work. and then send those citizens into this commonweal space. And I think putting those two things together is absolutely what I'm interested in thinking about. Yeah, that's great.
I think we have time for one more question, and I see Seth.
Hi, thank
Hi.
you for your talk. So it seemed like one of the ideas is that the current radical polarization we have in our society is partially, it's a feature and it's also a bug of pluralism itself. But one thing that you didn't really talk about that's important for the current radical polarization is that there are businesses and governments that have strong incentives to polarize our country and other countries around the world.
Yes.
And they're smart.
We're talking about Russian bots, aren't we?
Right,
now?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And you might worry that insofar as a community has a more substantive view of the good, they're easier to manipulate because you can track those, you can work on those values much more easily. They already have strong ideas, strong values, they're impassioned and inflamed. And communities with social media, you might worry, are completely different than communities.
So
100 years
the
ago.
substantive vision of the good actually becomes this lever you can grab hold of and pull them in it. That's a very fair point. So two thoughts. One is I'm already kind of rethinking this. So part of me now doesn't want to say that polarization is just pluralism run amok. Instead, what you might say is polarization is a manifestation of an inadequate way to deal with pluralism, right? So it's not itself a form of pluralism, it's a form of tribalism that is a refusal of pluralism of some sort. So, but then maybe your other point is, this is so hard to do and I don't know how to do it exactly, but really now what we would have to get down to is, it's not even just whether or not you have a substantive vision of the good. The question is, what is your substantive vision of the good, right? And we always want to retreat to a very formal conversation about this, and whereas I think it really does come down to, okay, well, what is the substance of the good? And therefore, what are the things that you value as virtues? And what are the things that you decry as vices? And if you remember, this is another place where I think McIntyre is interestingly helpful. McIntyre says, look, because excellences are telos relative, and the telos is specified by a narrative. What that means is the same disposition by one narrative could be a virtue, and in another narrative is a vice, actually. That's kind of, remember he does this thing where Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Aquinas basically look at the same dispositions and name them totally different things. It seems like what you could say is, depending on what your substantive specification of the good is, what I decry as a vice, you're valuing as a virtue, and then that would be susceptible to being leveraged, right? So, and interestingly, like, yeah, never mind. I was going to say, well, I'll try. On both left and right, for a very, very clunky way of putting it, it is interesting to me how victimhood can be leveraged as a virtue. On both left and right, everybody's impressed. Everybody is embattled, and so then you can, and it's such a generative anger machine, right? That then motivates all kinds of polarizing activities and tribalism. That's a really helpful insight. Thank you for that. That's great. Great.
Well, let's thank Jamie for
Thank
his
you.
wonderful presentation.